Hi and welcome to this first video in a series about LiveCode. So what is LiveCode, you might be wondering? Well then, if you're wondering about that, well then this series is actually for you. But actually kind of even before we start to dig into what LiveCode is, well then I would like to kind of describe for you what LiveCode is. And to do that, I would actually like to start with the history, kind of the background. Where did it all started? Well, even before LiveCode, in 1987, there is a man named Bill Atkinson, and he works at Apple, and he invents something that he calls HyperCard. And HyperCard is actually one of the first successful multimedia projects, or hypermedia projects that was called at that time. And the idea is that you can combine different medias. You can combine images with buttons, with fields, and so on and so forth. So you can easily create your application. And the idea behind HyperCard is that everyone should be able to create their own programs. You shouldn't need a bachelor degree in programming to be able to create a program. So it should be simple. And there is a book that is called the HyperCard Bible, or it's named actually the Complete HyperCard Handbook. And in that book there is a quote that says HyperCard is programming for poets. And I'm not sure if Danny Goodman thinks that poets are bad programmers, so they need an easy language. No, what I guess is that when writing HyperCard commands, every line of code is a full English sentence, or at least close to that one. So that means that you write sentences instead of esoteric program code. So that means that your full program is of course a poem. So therefore HyperCard is programming for poets. So the idea behind HyperCard is that it uses a metaphor where you have a stack of cards. You only see one card at a time, but then you can kind of flip between the cards as a kind of flip book. And every card is kind of like a blank canvas. You know, if you have a bunch of papers, you can write something on one paper, and then you have a new paper, you can write something else. And it's kind of the same here. So every new card is a blank canvas. So on every card you can add fields, you can add buttons, you can add whatever, all these kind of controls that are available. And then the idea is also, another idea is that you kind of connect the code directly, so you glue the code directly to the button or to the field. So when someone clicks on the mouse button where the pointer is over a button, well then the code is directly connected to that button, so you can open up the code for that button and you can see what happens. So that makes it easy to kind of follow and see, okay, when I click on this button, what happens then? So everything today is kind of, in almost every programming language, is kind of driven by messages, because you have the mouse is moving, your mouse, you're clicking with the mouse, you're typing on a key, there has elapsed some kind of time or whatever, and there are a lot of these messages, and you can then select if you would like to handle them. Then you write what's called a handler. And again, if you would like something to happen when you click with the mouse on a button, well then you can attach a handler for the mouse up event. So then you write on mouse up, and then you write code, and then in the end you have an end mouse up to kind of terminate that code. We will come back to that later. And another idea is to make the programming language simple, is to try to avoid using a lot of special characters with special meanings. You know that in a lot of programming language we have curly braces, we have semicolon, we have comma, and so on and so forth, and they all have special meanings. And then you need to know that meaning to be able to kind of understand the language. And if you try to programming, or if you used to maybe programming JavaScript, then you know if you miss a comma or semicolon somewhere, well then maybe nothing works. And HyperCard and then LiveCode is not using that kind of system, so it is a little bit easier to program in that way. And one a little bit more esoteric information might be that HyperCard was actually inspiration for the first browser when Tim Berners-Lee and his friends invented kind of the World Wide Web. HyperCard was kind of a great motivation. They wanted to take this but make it possible to kind of go online. But 2004, Apple decides that, well, no, we should have no HyperCard more. So they terminated that, and there was a great movement to try to convince Apple that you should try to keep HyperCard live. But Apple is Apple, so they have decided, no HyperCard more. So after that, it was a dead product. But actually, a couple of years before that, there is a Scottish company called Runrev, and they have presented a product that is called Revolution. And then it was Runtime Revolution. But the kind of Revolution system is very similar to HyperCard. Uses a similar language and so on and so forth. But it has a great advantage, and that is because HyperCard was for Mac only. And Revolution is actually available for Windows, Mac and Linux from the start. So it has a lot broader base. But it uses the same metaphor and principles as HyperCard. And actually, you can actually open HyperCard stacks in LiveCode. And today, of course, LiveCode has evolved, so it didn't stop where kind of HyperCard ended. Of course, it has evolved, so today you have a lot more functionality in LiveCode than you had in HyperCard. But in 2003, Runrev buys a competitor that's called MetaCard. That is actually another HyperCard clone. There is also something that is called SuperCard. There's a third clone, but it buys up this competitor. So now they kind of combine their code bases and gets a stronger product. In 2010, well, then Revolution changed its name to LiveCode, and also the company changed its name to LiveCode. So now everything is LiveCode. And now it can actually also create apps for iOS and Android. So now you have iOS, Android, you have Mac OS, you have Windows, and now you have Linux. So you have these 5 different platforms. And later on, actually, HTML is also another platform that you can use to create apps within LiveCode. And in 2013, LiveCode runs a very successful Kickstarter campaign, and that turns at least a branch of LiveCode into an open source product. So today you can download LiveCode and use it for free without paying a single dime. So today we have LiveCode in kind of 3 flavors, or maybe 4, because you have a business version, and you have an indie version, and you have a community version, and then there is also something that's called Community Plus. And Community Plus is kind of the paid versions, but you get all the extensions, because there are some extensions that are not supplied in the community open source version. But in the Community Plus, you get them all, but you can still only create open source applications. So, what is LiveCode then? Well, LiveCode is what's called an IDE, and that stands for Integrated Development Environment. That means that you are in a system where you can do everything. You can create your graphical user interface, you can write your code, you can debug your code, and so on and so forth. So everything, you kind of do everything from the very start to the very end within LiveCode. So that is an IDE. And you create your apps via drag and drop. And we will come back to that later on when we dig into LiveCode, of course. And one really big advantage with LiveCode compared to a lot of other systems is that you never need to compile your program, because you just switch from kind of one arrow to another arrow, and I will come back to that when we dig into LiveCode, and then you run your program. So there is no kind of turnaround time, there is no compile time. You just swap the arrows and then you're running. So that is really, really, really good. So as I said, LiveCode has a bunch of cards, and they are combined into a stack. And you only, of course, see one of these cards at a time. So if we are to create an address book, for example, that we will actually use later on, well, then we might have kind of a setup that looks like this, where you have an image, where you can have some text, and where you can set up the address and the phone numbers or email address or whatever. And of course, when we look at this on the computer, it kind of looks like this, because we have some kind of Windows system, and that looks different depending on your computer and your system. And of course, if you're on Windows or if you're on an iOS device, or if you're on an Android device, well, then you have no title bar at all, because you only see one stack at the time on these systems. But you have all these cards, and it uses this stack metaphor. So every window is a stack, and it can contain any number of cards as long as you have memory enough. And you only see one card at a time. And then remember that on the mobile, you only see one stack at a time. On the desktop, you can open multiple stacks, and that will be multiple windows to get to this one. But this was a really short introduction, but let's dig into LiveCode and see how to work with LiveCode instead.